The courtroom fell silent as Clint Eastwood entered. His weathered face, a canvas of decades in the public eye, revealed nothing as he approached the defendant's table. This wasn't Hollywood. No cameras, no scripts, no second takes. Just Courtroom 5 of the San Francisco Superior Court, where today the man who had directed Oscar-winning films would face judgment himself. Judge Eleanor Simmons watched him from the bench, her expression equally unreadable. At 62, she had built a reputation for being merciless with celebrities who believed their status placed them above the law. She had seen stars come and go through her courtroom, each believing they deserved special treatment. None had received it. The gallery was surprisingly full for what was supposed to be a routine hearing. Word had spread quickly. Clint Eastwood was facing charges for an environmental violation on his Carmel property. Reporters filled the back row, disappointed that cameras weren't allowed but frantically taking notes nonetheless. Eastwood sat with perfect posture, hands resting on the table. He was dressed in a simple navy suit, no flashy accessories or Hollywood flair. To his left, his attorney Marcus Powell arranged documents with careful precision. Powell, young and ambitious, leaned toward Eastwood and whispered something. Eastwood merely nodded, his eyes fixed on Judge Simmons. Docket number 47,623, People versus Eastwood, announced the clerk, her voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. Judge Simmons adjusted her glasses. We're here regarding charges of environmental code violations, specifically the unauthorized removal of protected trees on coastal property. How does the defendant plead? Powell stood. Not guilty, Your Honor. Across the aisle, District Attorney Richard Vance rose. His tailored suit and perfect haircut projected confidence and ambition. Your Honor, the evidence in this case is overwhelming. Mr. Eastwood knowingly removed 5 protected Monterey cypress trees from his property despite explicit warnings from environmental agencies. Simmons glanced at Eastwood, perhaps expecting to see some reaction. Anxiety, irritation, anything. But his expression remained calm, almost detached. This case has been filed as a criminal misdemeanor rather than a civil violation due to what we believe was willful and repeated disregard for environmental protections. Vance continued. The state seeks penalties and remediation. An unexpected tension had begun filling the courtroom. Those familiar with Judge Simmons' reputation exchanged glances. Something felt different about today. The judge's expression had hardened, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied some notes before her. I've reviewed the case file thoroughly, Simmons said, her voice carrying an edge that made even the most seasoned attorneys straighten in their seats. Mr. Eastwood, stand please. Eastwood rose slowly but steadily, his tall frame still impressive despite his age. You've had previous warnings about property modifications, haven't you, Mr. Eastwood? She asked. Before Powell could object, Eastwood answered directly. Yes, Your Honor. Simmons nodded as if confirming something to herself. And yet you proceeded anyway. There were circumstances, Powell began. I was addressing your client, Counselor. Simmons cut him off, her gaze never leaving Eastwood. Mr. Eastwood, this court has seen too many individuals of means who believe rules apply differently to them. Her voice was calm but carried unmistakable authority. Environmental protections exist for everyone's benefit, not just those without the resources to violate them. She paused, glancing at documents before her. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the court reporters seemed to hold her breath. Based on the evidence before me and your prior warnings, I'm issuing an immediate ruling. Simmons' decision to bypass normal procedure sent a ripple of surprise through the courtroom. Mr. Eastwood, you are hereby sentenced to 6 months of house arrest, electronic monitoring, a fine of $250,000, and mandated funding of a reforestation project in Monterey County. Powell jumped to his feet. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We haven't even presented our evidence or arguments. My client is entitled to... Your client is entitled to due process, which he has received. Simmons' voice hardened. The evidence is clear, and I'm not inclined to waste this court's time with unnecessary proceedings when the facts speak for themselves. Eastwood hadn't moved. His expression remained unchanged, though something flashed briefly in his eyes. Not fear or anger, but something closer to recognition. He had played enough judges in his career to recognize when one was making a statement rather than seeking justice. Your Honor, Eastwood's voice was quiet but firm, carrying that familiar gravelly quality that had commanded attention for decades. I respectfully request the opportunity to present my side of this matter. Simmons raised an eyebrow. You have excellent representation, Mr. Eastwood, yet you wish to speak for yourself? On this matter, yes. Powell looked concerned but knew better than to contradict his client publicly. District Attorney Vance leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. This was turning into an even better show than he had anticipated. Very well, Simmons conceded, though her tone suggested she was merely humoring him. But be advised that anything you say can affect your case. Eastwood nodded once, then turned slightly to address both the judge and the courtroom. The gallery leaned forward collectively, not wanting to miss a word from the legendary figure. Your Honor, I've spent over 50 years in the public eye. I've played heroes and villains. I've directed films about justice and injustice. His voice remained measured and calm. But today isn't about any character I've portrayed. It's about the law and how it's applied. He paused, his eyes moving deliberately across the courtroom before returning to Judge Simmons. And if the law is to mean anything, it must be applied correctly. Simmons' lips pressed into a thin line. Are you suggesting I'm not applying the law correctly, Mr. Eastwood? I'm suggesting that a ruling without hearing evidence isn't justice. It's something else entirely. The courtroom remained deathly quiet. Even D.A. Vance's smirk had faded. Eastwood was either very brave or very foolish to challenge Judge Simmons so directly. Simmons leaned forward. Mr. Eastwood, perhaps your experience playing lawyers on screen has given you an inflated sense of legal expertise. The evidence is in the file before me. Evidence without context, Your Honor, Eastwood replied, unmoved by her sarcasm. There's a difference between reading a screenplay and watching the finished film. A ripple of murmurs moved through the gallery. Eastwood's calm defiance was something few had witnessed in Simmons' courtroom. You removed protected trees after receiving explicit warnings not to do so, Simmons stated flatly. What context could possibly justify that? Eastwood met her gaze directly. Permission, Your Honor. This single word hung in the air. Powell quickly handed Eastwood a folder, which he opened with deliberate calm. I'd like to submit this document into evidence. It's a modified land management approval from the Coastal Commission, dated 3 months before the trees were removed. Judge Simmons' composure slipped for just a moment. She glanced at D.A. Vance, whose confident expression had suddenly faltered. Your Honor, Vance quickly interjected, this document wasn't included in the discovery materials. Because it was never requested, Powell responded smoothly, finding his footing now that the case was shifting. The prosecution built their case on previous warnings and violations, but never asked about subsequent approvals. Simmons held out her hand, and the bailiff brought her the document. The courtroom watched in tense silence as she reviewed it, her expression darkening with each passing moment. This appears to be in order, she finally admitted, but it contradicts the prosecution's entire premise. Mr. Vance, were you aware of this approval? Vance cleared his throat. No, Your Honor. Our department worked closely with environmental agencies who reported the violation. Then perhaps your department should improve its communication, Eastwood said, his voice carrying just enough edge to make everyone take notice. Judge Simmons's eyes narrowed as she studied Eastwood with renewed interest. This wasn't a flustered celebrity desperately trying to escape punishment. This was something else entirely. Mr. Eastwood, while this document is certainly relevant, it doesn't excuse bypassing proper channels. The approval states specific conditions that must be met before removal. Eastwood nodded, which is why I'd like to continue presenting my case, if the court will allow it. The room was charged with a new energy. The routine hearing had transformed into something unexpected, a showdown between a Hollywood legend and a judge known for her unyielding stance. Proceed, Simmons said, her tone suggesting she was prepared for whatever came next. Eastwood didn't immediately speak. Instead, he turned to Powell, who handed him another document. The strategic pause wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Eastwood had spent a lifetime understanding the power of timing, of silence before crucial lines. Officer Martinez, Eastwood continued once the room quieted, Had you inspected the site, would you have found that all preconditions had been met? Objection. Vance stood. Calls for speculation. Sustained, Simmons ruled. Eastwood barely acknowledged the exchange. Let me rephrase. Officer Martinez, I'm going to show you the documentation of precondition fulfillment that was posted at the worksite as required by code. He handed another document to Martinez, who reviewed it with growing discomfort. Does this documentation satisfy the preconditions of the permit you approved? Martinez swallowed hard. Yes, it does. And was this documentation available at the worksite as required? I didn't check the site for documentation. Thank you, Officer Martinez. Eastwood turned to the judge. No further questions for this witness. Judge Simmons' demeanor had transformed completely. The stern certainty was gone, replaced by careful consideration. She looked at D.A. Vance. Do you wish to cross-examine? Vance, recognizing the damage already done, shook his head. No, Your Honor. Simmons dismissed Martinez, who looked relieved to escape the stand. The courtroom remained tense as she studied the documents before her, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Finally, she looked up. Mr. Eastwood, I must admit I'm surprised by your grasp of environmental code and permit procedures. A hint of a smile touched Eastwood's eyes, but not his lips. I've always believed in understanding the rules before breaking them, Your Honor. In this case, I didn't break them at all. So it seems, she conceded. But I'm curious. How did an actor and director become so well-versed in coastal environmental regulations? I was mayor of Carmel by the Sea, Eastwood replied simply. Environmental stewardship was part of the job. Beyond that, I've developed several properties along the California coast over the decades. Experience as an effective teacher. A ripple of realization moved through the courtroom. Many had forgotten Eastwood's political past, seeing only the film star and director. Besides, and he added, when you've been sued as often as I have over the years, you learn to read the fine print. A few chuckles broke the tension. Even Simmons' lips twitched slightly before she regained her composure. Mr. Vance, she turned to the prosecutor, in light of this evidence, how does the state wish to proceed? Vance stood, clearly thrown off balance by the turn of events. Your Honor, the state would like time to review these documents and the testimony we've heard today. I imagine you would, Simmons replied dryly. However, given that I've already moved to sentencing based on what appears to be incomplete evidence, I don't believe delay serves justice. Eastwood remained standing, his posture relaxed but attentive. Those watching closely might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the only indication that this was more than just another scene to him. Your Honor, he said, may I make one more point? Simmons nodded, studying him with new interest. The Environmental Code exists for good reason, to protect natural resources that belong to everyone. I've supported those protections throughout my life. His voice carried the weight of conviction. The 5 trees in question were diseased and posed a safety risk to neighboring properties. The arborist's report confirmed this, which is why the modification was approved. He paused, making eye contact with Simmons. The 10-to-1 replacement wasn't just compliance, it was commitment. Those 50 new trees are already planted. This case isn't about disregard for environmental protection. It's about miscommunication between agencies and perhaps overzealous prosecution. The subtle emphasis on overzealous wasn't lost on anyone, least of all D.A. Vance, whose ambition for higher office was well known. Judge Simmons leaned back, her gaze moving between Eastwood and Vance. The courtroom remained silent, awaiting her decision. Mr. Eastwood, she finally said, you've presented compelling evidence that contradicts the state's case. More concerning is the testimony suggesting that proper procedures were ignored in bringing these charges. She turned to Vance. I expect better from your office, counselor. Prosecutorial discretion comes with responsibility. Vance nodded stiffly, his earlier confidence evaporated. In light of the evidence presented, Simmons continued, I am vacating my earlier ruling and dismissing all charges against Mr. Eastwood. The gallery erupted in whispers. Reporters were already slipping out to file their stories. However, she added, silencing the room once more, I want to be clear that this dismissal is based on the specific facts of this case. Environmental protections remain vital and will be enforced in my courtroom. Eastwood nodded respectfully. Thank you, Your Honor. As people began gathering their things, Simmons made one final statement. Mr. Eastwood, your performance today was educational. Perhaps you missed your calling. A hint of a smile crossed Eastwood's face. I'm a bit old to start a new career, Your Honor. I'll stick to what I know. And what exactly is that, Mr. Eastwood? She asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Telling stories that matter, he replied simply. Sometimes in front of the camera, sometimes behind it. Today, I just happened to be both. The response seemed to satisfy her. With a final tap of her gavel, Judge Simmons ended the proceedings. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Eastwood and Powell as they descended the steps. Camera flashes created a strobing effect in the bright afternoon sun. Mr. Eastwood, how does it feel to beat the system? One reporter called out. Eastwood paused, considering the question. I didn't beat any system. The system worked exactly as it should when all the facts are presented. Were you nervous when the judge immediately sentenced you? Asked another. In my experience, Eastwood replied, rushing to judgment usually means someone hasn't considered all the evidence. Today proved that. Powell tried to usher him through the crowd, but Eastwood moved at his own pace, unhurried despite the commotion. A young reporter pushed forward. Sir, do you think you received special treatment because of who you are? Eastwood stopped completely, turning to face the question directly. The crowd quieted, sensing a moment worth capturing. No, he said firmly. If anything, I was initially sentenced more harshly because of who I am. Judge Simmons wanted to make an example. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled press. What happened in that courtroom wasn't about celebrity. It was about facts, evidence, and the proper application of law. He started to turn away, but then added, every citizen deserves the right to present their case fully, not just those who can quote legal code from memory or who have access to good representation. Remember that part of the story when you write your headlines. With that, he continued down the steps, the crowd parting before him, not just because of his fame, but because of the quiet authority he carried. Powell caught up with him at the bottom of the stairs. That was quite a performance in there, he said quietly. You never told me you knew so much about environmental law. Eastwood gave a slight shrug. Never came up. You do realize that all these reporters are going to turn this into Dirty Harry Takes Down Judge, don't you? A flicker of amusement crossed Eastwood's weathered face. Probably, but we both know that's not what happened in there. What did happen exactly? Powell asked. You stepped in like you'd been preparing for this moment your whole life. Eastwood paused beside his car, considering the question. I've spent most of my life telling stories about justice, what it looks like when it works, and what happens when it fails. Today, I just made sure I was in the right story. As he slid into the driver's seat, reporters gathered around once more, shouting questions. Eastwood closed the door, shutting out the noise, and drove away from the courthouse. A free man who had never really doubted the outcome, only the path to get there. Back in her chambers, Judge Eleanor Simmons sat quietly, reviewing the case file with new eyes. Her clerk entered hesitantly. Judge, are you all right? Simmons looked up, her expression thoughtful. You know, Jacob, in 20 years on the bench, I've rarely been surprised. Today was educational. Because he was a celebrity? No, she said firmly. Because I made an assumption based on incomplete information, and he called me on it, correctly. She closed the file. That's rare. Most people, when a judge makes a ruling, accept it even if it's wrong. So you admire him for standing up to you? Jacob asked, surprised. I admire anyone who knows their rights and exercises them properly, she corrected. The fact that it was Clint Eastwood just makes for a better story at my next dinner party. She rose from her desk. Pull the files on all environmental cases currently before me. I want to review them personally. All of them? Jacob looked alarmed. That's over 30 cases. Yes, all of them. Her tone brooked no argument. If one case was built on faulty agency communication, there might be others. As Jacob hurried to comply, Simmons stared out her window at the courthouse steps where reporters still lingered. She had always prided herself on being thorough, on not giving preferential treatment to the wealthy or famous. Today had been a humbling reminder that rushing to judgment, even with the best intentions, wasn't justice. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had wanted to show that fame couldn't buy leniency in her courtroom, but in her zeal, she had denied proper process to the very person she was trying to treat equally. It was a mistake she wouldn't make again. On the other side of San Francisco, in a quiet neighborhood bar far from the courthouse, Officer Derek Martinez sat alone, nursing a whiskey. His phone had been ringing nonstop since leaving the courtroom. Calls from his supervisor, from the department's PR team, even one from the district attorney's office. He had ignored them all. Martinez swirled the amber liquid in his glass, replaying the day's events in his mind. He had known filing that violation report was wrong. He had approved the permit himself, had seen the extensive mitigation plan. But when pressure came from above, hints that his upcoming promotion might depend on his team player attitude, he had compromised. And now here he sat, his integrity in tatters, all because he hadn't expected Clint Eastwood to show up with documentation so precise it could have been prepared by a seasoned environmental attorney. The bartender approached. "Another?" Martinez shook his head. "Number, I think I've made enough bad decisions lately." As he paid his tab, he made a decision. Tomorrow he would submit a full report about the pressure to file violations against high-profile property owners regardless of compliance. His promotion would likely vanish, but at least he could look at himself in the mirror again. Sometimes, he reflected, it took facing someone like Eastwood, someone who refused to bend even when it would be easier, to remember what integrity actually looked like. 2 weeks later, Clint Eastwood stood on his Carmel property, watching as landscapers planted the last of 50 young Monterey cypress trees. The saplings were small now, but in time, they would grow into the majestic trees that characterize this coastline. He wouldn't live to see them reach maturity, but future generations would. His phone rang, the specialized tone he had set for his production company. Without taking his eyes off the planting, he answered, "Eastwood. Clint, have you seen the news?" It was his longtime producer, excitement evident in his voice. "The DA's office in San Francisco is under investigation. Seems there was a pattern of targeted environmental enforcement against high-profile property owners. They're saying your case broke it open." Eastwood watched as rich soil was tamped down around the base of a sapling. "Is that right?" "There's more. Judge Simmons has ordered a review of all environmental cases in her court. 3 have already been dismissed due to similar circumstances." "Good," Eastwood said simply. "The press is calling you a legal crusader for property rights. They want interviews, statements. 60 Minutes called our office this morning." Eastwood sighed. "I didn't do anything special. I just didn't accept an injustice when I saw one." "That's exactly what makes it a great story, Clint. The man who's played tough guys standing up to a real-life judicial overreach. People are eating it up." Eastwood remained silent, watching as the landscapers moved to the next planting location. The young trees swayed slightly in the coastal breeze, fragile yet resilient. "You're not interested in the publicity, are you?" his producer finally asked, already knowing the answer. "Not particularly." "Well, at least tell me this. Where did you learn all that legal stuff? Everyone's wondering how you pulled it off. Some bloggers are speculating you have a secret law degree." Eastwood almost smiled. "No secret degree, just experience and preparation." "But seriously, you sounded like a lawyer in there. The transcripts are circulating online. People are calling it the Eastwood defense." This time Eastwood did smile. "I've played lawyers. I've hired lawyers. I've been sued by lawyers. After a while, you pick things up." "So that's it? You just picked it up?" Eastwood watched as the final sapling was secured with stakes to protect it from the wind. Like justice, he thought, sometimes the youngest and most fragile things needed the most protection to grow strong. "When you've been around as long as I have," he said finally, "you learn that most systems, Hollywood, politics, even courts, run on rules. Understand the rules, prepare thoroughly, and stay calm when others don't expect you to. That's not legal brilliance. That's just common sense." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The landscapers were packing up their tools, the job complete. 50 new trees where 5 diseased ones had stood, a tenfold improvement for the environment, and a reminder that sometimes fighting the system was the best way to honor its purpose. Later that evening, as sunset painted the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson, Eastwood sat on his deck with a script in his lap. It was a legal drama, ironically enough, sent by his agent days before the court hearing. He had set it aside, unread until now. As he flipped through the pages, the story of an underdog lawyer fighting corruption in a small town, he found himself making mental notes, places where the legal details didn't quite ring true, moments where the protagonist could show rather than tell their expertise. His recent courtroom experience had given him a fresh perspective. There was a rhythm to legal proceedings, a dance of power and precision that most films failed to capture accurately. They focused on dramatic objections and surprise witnesses, missing the subtle battles fought in footnotes and statutory language. Perhaps, he thought, closing the script, there was a different story worth telling, one about how justice worked in quiet moments of preparation, in the willingness to stand firm when easier paths presented themselves. His phone rang again, a number he didn't recognize. Normally, he would let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. Eastwood. Mr. Eastwood. The voice was instantly recognizable. Judge Eleanor Simmons. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Surprised, he set the script aside. Not at all, Judge. What can I do for you? I wanted to inform you personally that your case has prompted some significant changes in my courtroom. Her tone was professional but carried an undertone of respect that hadn't been there before. All environmental cases are now subject to enhanced evidence review before proceeding. That sounds like a positive step. It is. She paused. I also wanted to say that while I didn't appreciate being challenged in my courtroom, I did appreciate the reminder of why process matters. Eastwood remained silent, letting her continue. Few people would have stood their ground as you did. Fewer still would have been prepared enough to make it count. I found that preparation usually pays off one way or another, he replied. Indeed. Another pause. Well, that's all I wanted to say. Good evening, Mr. Eastwood. Judge. He ended the call, slightly bemused by the unusual contact. As darkness settled over the coastline, Eastwood reflected on the strange path that had led him here, from actor to director, to mayor, to reluctant legal crusader. None of it had been planned exactly. He had simply followed his instincts, stood by his principles, and been willing to fight when necessary. In the end, perhaps that was the real story worth telling. Not how one man had outmaneuvered a judge or exposed an overzealous prosecution, but how systems could correct themselves when challenged properly, with respect for their purpose rather than contempt for their power. Tomorrow there would be more calls, more requests for interviews, more attempts to turn a simple matter of right and wrong into something sensational. He would decline most of them, preferring to let his actions in that courtroom speak for themselves. For now, though, he was content to sit in the gathering darkness, listening to the wind in the newly planted trees, and knowing that sometimes the most important victories were the quiet ones. Victories of principle over expediency, of careful preparation over hasty judgment. Justice, like filmmaking, was ultimately about telling the truth as clearly as possible. Today in Courtroom 5 of the San Francisco Superior Court, Clint Eastwood hadn't just defended himself against unwarranted charges, he had reminded everyone present of what justice was supposed to look like. Not bad, he thought with a hint of satisfaction, for a day that was supposed to be routine. Outside, the young cypress trees stood sentinel in the moonlight, their shadows stretching toward the future, a future they would outlive him to see. That, he decided, was legacy enough for anyone. 50 new beginnings where others had seen only endings. The rest was just a good story to tell. 3 months later, a small envelope arrived at Eastwood's production office. Inside was a newspaper clipping and a brief handwritten note. The clipping detailed the resignation of District Attorney Richard Vance following an investigation into improper prosecution practices. The note, written in Judge Simmons' precise hand, contained just 5 words. Justice works when properly applied. Eastwood tucked both into a drawer without comment. But that afternoon, he called his writers together and pitched a new project. Not about a celebrity fighting the system, but about an ordinary citizen who discovers that knowing the rules is sometimes the most powerful form of resistance. Sometimes, he explained to them, the most compelling stories aren't about breaking the law, but about understanding it well enough to ensure it protects everyone equally. It wasn't the story people expected from him, but then again, he had made a career out of defying expectations. The best stories, like the best legal defenses, were the ones that revealed truth one carefully chosen detail at a time. And as filming began on this new project, somewhere in San Francisco, Officer Derek Martinez was testifying before a review board, explaining how pressure from above had led to targeted enforcement against high-profile individuals. His promotion was indeed gone, but as he detailed the systematic issues that had corrupted the process, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the weight of integrity. In Judge Simmons' courtroom, a new case was underway. A small business owner faced environmental violations similar to Eastwood's. But this time, Judge Simmons listened patiently as evidence was presented from both sides, asking pointed questions and ensuring all documentation was thoroughly examined before making any ruling. The changes weren't dramatic or headline-grabbing. They were small adjustments to procedure, careful attention to detail, and a renewed commitment to the principle that justice required patience. But their impact would ripple outward, affecting countless cases that would never make the news. Meanwhile, in Carmel, the 50 cypress saplings continued their slow, steady growth, silent witnesses to a story that was less about one man's legal brilliance and more about a system remembering its purpose. D.A. Vance had moved on to private practice, his political ambitions diminished but not extinguished. Judge Simmons had quietly become a voice for procedural reform in judicial conferences, and Clint Eastwood had returned to what he did best: telling stories that mattered. His newest film wasn't just another legal drama, it was a meditation on justice. Not the theatrical kind that made for dramatic courtroom speeches, but the careful, methodical kind that happened in the spaces between arguments, in the diligent review of evidence, in the courage to stand firm when easier paths presented themselves. Critics would later call it one of his most nuanced works, noting how it avoided the typical Hollywood tropes of legal heroism in favor of something more subtle and truthful. Audiences would find themselves unexpectedly moved by a story that celebrated not victory over the system, but the patient work of making the system function as intended. When asked in interviews about his inspiration, Eastwood would give his characteristic half-smile and say simply, "Sometimes you have to fight for the law to protect you, but if you're going to fight, you'd better know exactly what you're fighting for." 1 year to the day after his appearance in Courtroom 5, Eastwood returned to his Carmel property just as the sun was setting. The cypress saplings had grown noticeably, reaching upward with new branches, their root systems strengthening beneath the soil. He walked among them, inspecting their progress with the same careful attention he had once given to the legal documents that had secured his freedom. Each tree represented something beyond mere compliance with environmental regulations. They were living proof that systems, when properly challenged and properly respected, could produce something better than what had existed before. As darkness fell, he stood at the edge of his property, looking out over the Pacific. Behind him, 50 young trees swayed in the coastal breeze, stronger now, more resilient, but still requiring care and protection to reach their full potential. Like justice, he thought, always growing, always in need of tending. In San Francisco, a law student was poring over the transcript of Eastwood versus California in a legal theory class. The professor had assigned it as a case study in procedural justice, how knowing and properly invoking the rules could sometimes matter more than emotional appeals or theatrical performances. "What strikes me most," the student said during discussion, "isn't that Eastwood won his case. It's how he won it, with preparation, precision, and a fundamental respect for the system even as he challenged it." The professor nodded. "And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson here. The law isn't just about knowing what's written in the books. It's about understanding how to make those words matter when it counts the most." Across the city, Judge Simmons was reviewing a new environmental case file. She moved methodically through the evidence, checking for gaps, inconsistencies, or signs of the very procedural shortcuts she herself had once employed. Her colleagues had noticed the change in her approach: more deliberate, more thorough, less inclined to rush to judgment. The Eastwood effect, they called it behind her back, though never to her face. But Simmons didn't mind. She had learned something valuable that day in courtroom 5, something about the purpose of her position and the true meaning of equal justice. If that lesson had come from an unlikely teacher, so be it. The best lessons often came from unexpected sources. As she set aside the file, satisfied that all procedures had been properly followed, she thought briefly of the note she had sent months ago. Justice works when properly applied. 4 words that had changed her approach to every case since then. Sometimes, she reflected, it took someone standing firmly against the tide to remind everyone else which direction they should be swimming. And in Carmel, as stars appeared above the coastline, Clint Eastwood sat on his deck, reading through the final script revisions for his new film. The story had evolved considerably from his initial concept, becoming something deeper and more nuanced. A tale not of triumph over the system, but of ensuring the system worked as it should. Tomorrow cameras would roll, actors would bring to life a story inspired by his unexpected day in court. Critics would eventually have their say, but tonight, in the quiet darkness, he was content knowing that sometimes the most important victories weren't the ones that made headlines. They were the ones that changed how people thought about justice, not as something abstract or unattainable, but as a living, breathing system that required constant tending, like the young trees growing stronger with each passing day on his property. As he set aside the script and prepared to turn in for the night, he glanced once more at the coastline bathed in moonlight. The legal battle that had brought him here was already fading into memory, but its legacy would continue, in reformed procedures, in a judge's more careful consideration, in an officer's renewed commitment to integrity. And perhaps most importantly, in a story that reminded audiences that justice wasn't just something that happened in courtrooms. It was something built piece by piece, day by day, through the seemingly small choices of individuals who refused to accept that rules should apply differently to different people. That, Eastwood decided as he turned toward home, was a story worth telling.